The second thing, the second thing I have to admit is that I'm not an entomologist. I'm not an ecophysiologist. I'm a forester by training, and so certainly there's information and knowledge and experience that overlaps with this, but it's not my specialty. And I think that's part of the reason that I was a little hesitant to engage with the topic. But the reality is that we all play a unique and special and important role in addressing emerald ash borer. And so today I'm hoping to describe for you today a little bit more about ash and emerald ash borer, but I'm hoping to provide you with information and confidence to be able to move forward in both forest management and with ash preservation so that we can keep this species out on the landscape. So with that, I am going to, I guess I'll also start with the ending message, which is my experience is that there is a narrative out there that ash is done, that, just chalk it up, we're going to lose ash. And I honestly don't think that's the case. And I honestly am not ready to give up. And so there are strategies to preserve ash. There are strategies to help our forests move through this challenge, but it takes people like you. But please, I'm hoping by the end of this presentation that you have the sense that there are good and important things to do to be proactive to keep ash out on our landscapes. So I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Tony D'Amato, who's here on the slide with me. His name's on the slide. A lot of this work, Tony's been looking at ash. Tony was working professionally on the faculty at University of Minnesota, and so was working there, and then now is at University of Vermont, and is really focused on applied ecology and silviculture. And so, he has a lot of experience on the silvicultural side of emerald ash borer. And so we put this publication together as a team, as a part of some larger efforts, and I'll show our other colleagues at the end of the presentation. So the first thing I want to just acknowledge is, we get so many wonderful public benefits from our forests, and we tend to think of them as these monolithic things. They're forests, and we know they're dynamic, we know they're complex, but we're really blessed in New England and the Northeast with a diversity of species and a diversity of forest types. Each of those species, each of those trees brings unique benefit to us as humans and are an important critical component of forests and how they operate. And as we move forward into an uncertain future with climate change and different invasive plants and invasive insects and so forth, I would suggest to you, and one of the main tenets of resilience is a focus on diversity. And diversity provides both functional diversity, but it also provides redundancy within our forest, that if we lose a species, that there will be other species to take that function. We don't want to lose species for sure, but certainly diversity is a bedrock of that. We have these beautiful diverse species within our forest, and ash is one of them, and we're at risk of letting it go by. And so it's our job to not. There are about 16 species of ash across the United States. This is a map of ash densities across the northeastern US. The darker the color, the greater the density of ash. And as you can see, in Massachusetts, we have a decent amount of ash, particularly in the western part of the state. So as we see from Boston to Pittsfield, from east to west, we see a difference. What this is picking up is mostly a difference in soil and site characteristics. So we've got sandier soils that have more drainage out on the Cape and Boston and that part of the state. And as we move west, we move into these richer, more mesic sites, and that's what ash likes, as we'll talk about. But ash is ubiquitous across our landscape, and so as a component of these diverse forests, they play a really important role. I'm going to start with a couple slides because, and just know that you're a challenging audience, in the sense that I looked at the people that were logging on, and I know that there are foresters out there, and I know that there are people that are probably doing this work, so you know a lot, and I know there are landowners out there that might be on the beginning end of this, so a bit challenging. I'll try to address everybody's knowledge and needs, but I want to start, for those people that aren't quite sure how to identify ash, just how that they could walk through their their own forest, their town's forest, their land trust, fee-owned land, and identify ash. And the first thing I want to point out is that ash is what we call an opposite branching pattern tree. So I put some orange circles around here. That means that the branches come directly off of each other, right opposite each other. In fact, I would not only say that ash is opposite, but it's strongly opposite. And I say that because the branches are a little bit thicker, and so they're really pronounced in terms of that opposite branching pattern. The other common species that we have in our forest that is also opposite is maple. But one of the first things you can do, whether it be winter, summer, spring, or fall, is you can look at the branching pattern, and if it's opposite, you know that it's either an ash or a maple. So let's take a look at the bark. White ash bark has deep fissures. It has this sort of diamond pattern to it. The bark is very firm. Green ash, which is another common ash species in our area, has a similar bark pattern. The fissures aren't as deep typically as the white ash bark, but it maintains that diamond pattern. And the bark itself is a little more flaky. It's less firm. And then the third common ash species that we see in the Northeast are what we typically call black ash. Some people call it brown ash. And if you squint, you can kind of still see that diamond-shaped pattern, but the bark is much corkier and has a real flake to it. So again, this is something that you can help identify, whether it be leaf on or leaf off. And then let's look at the leaves of white ash, green ash, and black ash. They have a lot of similarities. And so I think the big take home from this slide is when you are trying to identify ash in the growing season, ash has a compound leaf. So if you look at the picture of white ash, you'll see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what we would call leaflets. Those individual leaves aren't the leaf of an ash tree, that's the leaflet. So the 2, 4, 6, the 7 leaflets together is actually one leaf of an ash tree. So we call that a compound leaf because it has multiple parts to it. And typically ash will have 7 to 9 of these leaflets. If you have a tree that is an opposite branching pattern and a compound leaf, that's an ash tree. Now, the next question is it white ash, green ash, or black brown ash? And I'll answer that in a minute. But just in terms of you understanding if you have ash out on your property, this is another way you can look at it. There are specific ways that you can distinguish between each of these specific species of leaves. But I think just understanding that they're compound leaves will go very far in helping you identify ash. To me, this is probably the best and easiest way to identify ash is based on its silvix or based on the site it grows on. There's a distinct pattern across the landscape between where white ash grows, green ash grows, and black brown ash grows. They all like moist sites. So you will find these knotted tops of ridges or in dry sandy soil typically, where you'll find them are deep moist sites, such as you'd find at the base of a hill or in a riparian area or in a concave landscape, someplace that's collecting water, collecting nutrients, and so forth. They really like those moist, rich, deep soils. White ash is an upland species, meaning it likes those deep, rich soils, but it grows in areas that aren't resource areas. It grows in upland areas, but upland areas that have that deep, rich soil. And so on the diagram, you see that all the white ash are on the left. Green ash grows primarily in riparian areas. So it's sort of the transition between the white ash and the black brown ash. It will grow, it can tolerate higher amounts of water within the soil, but not full standing water. And then by the time you get to black brown ash can really tolerate, high water table. So you would find you can find black brown ash in areas of wetlands, standing, water all the way into those riparian areas. So if you start getting comfortable with the bark, with the branching pattern, with the leaves, you just sort of narrow it down like, yeah, this is some kind of ash tree. And then you take a look on where in the landscape it's growing. That will be a strong indicator of whether it's white or green or black brown ash. So ash trees are what we call, and I'm explaining this not only because I love ecology, but because the characteristics of the ash tree are important to know and relate to the management and preservation strategies that I'll talk about in the back half of the presentation. Ash is what we call dioecious. That means that every individual is either male or female. All right, not all plants are like that. Some plants have both male and female components, but ash is dioecious, so it has male and female individuals. As you learned growing up in the birds and the bees, you need males and females to create that fertilized egg and that sexual regeneration. This means that we need both males and female individuals out in the landscape. The female flowers appear in April or May, so we're sort of coming up on that timeline. And so it can be a good time to get out there and take a look. In the late summer, it's a good time to go out and take a look at ash seeds. So if the ash tree has seeds on it, it's a female tree. And one of the strategies we'll talk about is identifying female trees. Please know, however, that trees don't go to seed like this on an annual basis. So it's likely that every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there is an ash crop. So if you've walked out and you were looking for seeds to identify female trees, and you just go out this August or September and don't see them, that's not necessarily that it's not a female. You should go back and revisit. In terms of when ash becomes sexually mature and are able to throw seed that are fertilized, it's roughly around 20 years old. So that translates, again, roughly to an 8 or 10-inch diameter at breast height. The seeds travel about 450 feet, and germination is best in partial sun and partial shade. Again, these are all attributes that I'll bring in later when we talk about these management strategies. So we need to know that we've got sexually mature trees out there. That's that first bullet. We need to know sort of spacing. How far can we expect these seeds to go? We can manipulate light levels to encourage that partial sun, that ash seeds do well in. And this fourth bullet is bolded and it's in green. It's a really important point. Ash shifts in its shade tolerance from shade tolerant when it's really young to intolerant as it gets older, which means that ash seeds, as they are, spread out within the forest floor, may start, but unless there's an opening that's big enough to give them the light they need, ash won't regenerate through those shady conditions. So again, that relates to our management strategy. Some species, for those of you not familiar with the term shade tolerant and intolerant, some species have evolved over time to be competitive in low sunlight. They've got low respiration rates. And other trees, and that would be an example would be hemlock or sugar maple, beech. Some species are shade intolerant, which means they need lots of light because their strategy is to grow fast. Ash in its seedling phase sort of shifts. It can tolerate some shade. It can be seated underneath parents and in a closed canopy, but unless some light is created, it won't survive. So that's a little bit about ash and its ecology, where to find it, how to identify it. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about emerald ash borer. So for those of you who haven't heard of emerald ash borer or aren't sure what the story is, it was first detected in Michigan back around 2002. But by the time you actually identify it as being present, it's likely that it had been there for a number of years and its populations were building to the point where it was actually detectable. Like many invasive pests and plants and insects, because we share a similar climate with Asia, emerald ash borer comes from Asia like other invasive insects and plants. It was likely brought in here by some woody material. There's the downside to global trade, right? We're moving things around the globe that normally wouldn't have evolved here. And because it came from another region, does not have a natural predator that we would have hoped for to help keep that in check. We, as humans, have been spreading it not only around the globe, but once it was detected in Michigan, and as it started being mapped out, we started seeing some really fast spread rates, primarily because people were moving wood that had EAB in it, particularly firewood. So we helped to spread this insect around the United States. It has killed millions of trees. It is quantified as, or at least I've seen it described as, the most financially or economically damaging insect that we've run into. So it is here. There's not much we can do about it now. And now the question is, how do we react to it? How do we ensure our forest can continue? Real quick, in terms of the life cycle, because it's important to understand when it's damaging to trees. It's a beautiful beetle. And so as you can see on the left there, it's this beautiful metallic green color. Adults emerge here in late spring, and they feed on the canopy of the trees. That canopy does not really, it causes very little damage. I mean, trees have evolved to insect defoliation at reasonable levels over eons. So that's not the damaging part. After it emerges, it will lay eggs, and after about a week or so, those larvae actually will go into the bark, and that larva will feed on the interior of the bark and the phloem, that interior tissue between the live and dead portion of the tree. And as it feeds on that, it creates this S-shaped gallery, and I've got a couple pictures of that in a slide or two, and that disrupts, those galleries is what disrupts the flow, the water and nutrients from the roots and the photosynthetic material, the carbohydrates that are moving down to the roots. So it essentially cuts off the supply chain, so to speak, for the tree. And it's that, it essentially girdles the tree, and it's that ultimately leads to mortality. And as I'll show in the next few slides, there are some signs that you can identify or you can look for as to whether or not an ash has EAB. Unfortunately, in some ways, the signs that we see in the tree largely start in the crown and then work its way down. So one of the first things we see is thinning crowns. And as you can see, these are trees that have lost their crowns, or at least most of them. And so this crown dieback is certainly a sign that something is not right with the tree. Another sign that you can look for, and again, it starts in those upper crown positions, but then it moves down the tree, is what we call blonding. And the blonding are these patches of lighter bark. It's actually the interior of the bark that is created by woodpeckers because these larvae are really protein rich. And so the woodpeckers are going after the bark and trying to go after that larva. And what it does is it throws off some of that exterior bark, and it exposes this brighter bark. We call it blonding. So if you're out looking for impacts or whether or not the ash has been infested, blonding is yet another sign that you can look for. When trees are stressed, one of their reactions is to put out more foliage, right? The idea of that foliage is to create more photosynthetic capacity, right? These are the solar panels for the tree. This is how it gains nutrients, can gain energy to help keep it surviving. So you might see epicormic branches. So those are dormant buds under the bark that start sprouting to create more leaf area. And that's a sign of a stressed tree, as are these basal sprouts. So if you look at a tree, and it's just in general, this isn't just with EAB, but epicormic branches and basal sprouts are a sign that the tree is stressed out. And in our particular context, that could be because it's EAB. These are the adult emergent holes. They're pretty small, as you saw, I hope, from the picture a few slides ago. The EAB is no more than a half an inch maybe, and smaller than a penny. So, and that's their adult stage. When they emerge, the exit holes, the emergence holes, are pretty small, but they have a very noticeable and identifiable flat spot in them. They look like a D, like a capital D. And so if you're seeing that along the bark of an ash tree, that's likely that there are adults emerging there. This is what causes the real mortality and the real stress. As I said, this is the larva. It has gotten into the bark, and it is feeding on that phloem and that inner bark, and that's what's disrupting it. So it has, and different insects have different gallery shapes. For the EAB, it really is sort of this S shape. Now, by the time you get to this point and bark is sloughing off, you're probably in pretty rough shape. But it's yet another sign that EAB is here. There are a number of goals, and this comes out of work, and I'll show this team of people that have been working with over the last year or two on this topic. We put out a couple papers, and we want to make sure that we encourage people to consider the fact that there are a number of reasons, number of goals that we're trying to achieve through these forest management strategies and ash preservation in general. And one of those is just an ethical responsibility. So I would suggest to you that we have an ethical responsibility with a species that is in peril, that is at risk for going to extinction, at least locally in our region. And I believe just as stewards, as partners, we have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility to maintain species within our forests, within all the ecosystems. And I just love this quote from Leopold talking about, something that preserves the stability and beauty is good. It's the right thing to do. And as I talked about at the beginning of the webinar, we've got very diverse forests, which is wonderful. We've got all these diverse species. We don't want to lose any. We want to keep the integrity. We want to keep the diversity. One of the themes we've been really trying to emphasize, particularly with ash, is the cultural implications of ash and other species, but in this particular subject or webinar, we're talking about ash. Ash is an important part of many indigenous cultures. The Wabanaki have a creation story about ash in terms of how people were created. Ash is central, black ash in particular, black-brown ash, is used for basket making, which is central to their cultural ways. And so, the more I've been doing this work and the more I guess I can be cold and slimy. I'm just, zeroed in on the ecological pieces of this and restoring different parts back to the forest and things. But the reality is we're not just restoring parts of the forest, we're restoring and preserving parts of cultures and peoples, and that's hugely important. So, not only is our effort, meant to help with the ecology of forests, but with our indigenous partners and with indigenous lifeways. Certainly, there are ecological benefits to this that we're trying to sustain. And as I said earlier, we've got lots of different species. Different species play different roles in the forest. There have been some interesting sort of literature review papers done on, like, all right, so if we lose ash, what's the big deal? Like, who's using ash? And they identify almost 100 different insect species, invertebrates, that utilize primarily ash and feed on it. So, it's one of those things, like everything's tied to everything else. So as if we were to lose ash, that affects, dozens and dozens, another 100 at least species out there. And so to sustain the full range of biodiversity, we want to sustain all of these species and all of the wonderful connections they have within the forest that frankly we may or may not know. The other thing I want to mention that's unique to ash is that its bark is less acidic than other trees, and as such, it has a real propensity, if you will, or provides a wonderful substrate for a broad diversity of lichens and different fungi. So, and ash can live to an old age, hundreds of years, and get really big. And so from a biodiversity perspective, we want ash trees in our forests. We know that they're wonderful substrates for these wonderful biodiversity. And so losing them means that we're losing this opportunity with these other species. Genetic diversity is another goal. Thankfully, trees, just as an organism, as a species, are wonderfully diverse from a genetic standpoint, which is great. And we know we're facing, a lot of change over time in our forests, and genetic mutations are the way species adapt and change over time. Lots of times the mutation doesn't matter, or maybe it's a negative to being competitive in that environment. But sometimes that change, that genetic diversity, is what sustains it through that challenge. And so what we're looking for is to sustain lots of genetic diversity all over the ecosystem. But for today, in terms of our conversation, we want to sustain as much ash genetic diversity as possible with the hopes that some of those will show themselves to be resistant, resilient to EAB. And of course, sometimes these goals are not, in silos. They have a lot of overlap to them. So I'm just going to pause for a second and let you read this. This is obviously from Braiding Sweetgrass. And to me, it's just a wonderful quote about both the cultural importance of the species, but also our ethical obligation, that sense of reciprocity between humans and forests, and facilitating that and cultivating that, and showing that overlap between ethical and cultural lifeways. I also have a picture here of Les Benedict, who has been a partner in this work that we've been doing from the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, who's just done, just a tremendous amount of work on seed saving and helping us understand the importance of ash and ways to preserve it, and actually applying things on the ground. So we're learning a lot from Les, and wanted to include him. So let's talk about some of the active strategies here to do two different things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is, how do we help forests in general? What are there opportunities to help forests move through ash? In other words, after EAB has come through, and in some areas, most areas it's here, maybe in some areas it's starting to come through, but we're sort of seeing this wave, we're living in this wave, and how do we help forests get to the other side of that in a way that helps sustain them and helps sustain the many benefits that we rely on from forests? And my friend, colleague Tony, who I introduced, so to speak, in the first slide, is fond of saying, manage the forest, not the insect. And I think up front, there has been too much of an emphasis on managing the insect, when in reality, what we need to do is manage the forest. What are we looking for from these future forests? How do we help them move through and have a structural and a species composition that will help not only sustain them and their function, but those benefits they provide? So let's talk about that first, and then we'll get into some more very specific preservation strategies for ash. First of all, and maybe most important from this perspective, is focus on regeneration. And this goes for, I think, all forests in general, whether you're talking about biodiversity or climate change or water quality. We are facing more and more challenges with regeneration, whether it be deer herbivory or invasive plants, climate change, droughts, those sorts of things. Zeroing in and making sure that we are reestablishing or establishing regeneration within our forests in a timely and sufficient manner is paramount. It is sort of, in part, the foundation that forests need. And without that, we've got this long-lived overstory, but we don't have anything coming up underneath. So focus on regeneration. These species, ash, particularly white ash, and again, I should have mentioned this. I have divided this into upland strategies and combined strategies. What I'm showing here is not something that you would necessarily want to do in a wetland, not something you would necessarily want to do in a riparian area. This is, because of balancing our need for, water quality and habitat in those areas and so forth. So these are upland strategies. So creating, as I said, ash likes those mesic sites. They share those mesic sites with species like sugar maple and yellow birch. So one way to assist forests through this is making sure, especially if there is advanced regeneration of sugar maple and yellow birch, you create some small openings to release that advanced regeneration so it can occupy that space and be the next generation of forest. If you are interested in actually regenerating ash, and I would encourage you to consider that, ash species, because of that shade intolerance, needs a good amount of sunlight. So where helping sugar maple and yellow birch, which are more shade tolerant, really is just small openings, a crown or two. When we're talking about regenerating ash, we're talking about gaps. We're talking about a quarter to a third of an acre in size, things like, group selection for the foresters out there. We can also encourage the seeds by creating that dappled light, that 50, remember we talked about that, it does best in that 50-50 sunlight. We can, through shelterwood methods, create these conditions of partial shade, partial sun, again, for the foresters by reducing basal areas to about 30-60 square feet or about half of the canopy. It's important, again, to recognize that ash transitions from shade tolerance, so it can live under its parents, it can live under a canopy for a little while, but if it doesn't get, once it gets to that shade intolerant phase, if it doesn't get that big sunlight, it's not going to be competitive, it's not going to regenerate. And we want ash to regenerate. We'll talk about that in a few slides. This is the same gap right here, but that's the ash. And I want to make the point that ash, because it's shade intolerant, grows fast. That puts its crown up above other species, and that can make it susceptible to deer herbivory. So deer herbivory is just sort of a challenge generally, and in some areas, it's a huge challenge in terms of getting the next generation of forest established. With ash, it has this separate challenge of growing fast, of being really competitive in that way, but it can single itself out. So deer herbivory is something you've got to really keep an eye on. Also, in terms of regeneration, you've got to look at, see what's in the understory. This is on the left is a picture of ash with an understory of beech. If this goes by, if ash goes by, what we're going to end up with is a stand of beech. Nothing necessarily wrong with beech. Beech nuts are good for wildlife. I think it's a beautiful tree, but it does have forest health issues. It doesn't necessarily always grow into these large sizes from a carbon perspective or from a habitat perspective. We have beech leaf disease now. So, whether or not this is the direction that, that will serve both the forest and our benefits the best is something you've got to consider. If you are trying to regenerate ash in particular, then on those richer sites, beech likes the sites that are less rich, which is why it's established here, but you really have to create some bigger openings for it to be more competitive against these sugar maple and yellow birch, if that's your goal. The other picture, of course, is another issue that we run into from a regeneration perspective, and that is a number of invasive plant species also like mesic sites in wet conditions. And when we have this decline of beech and we have this opportunity for resources, space, sunlight, water, nutrients, it can be, these invasive plants that take over. So being very astute about and treating these invasive plants is important in terms of ensuring regeneration for ash and for other tree species. We want to maintain a diversity of sizes out on our landscape. In many ways, what we're trying to do is keep the plates spinning, okay? And so we have large trees that are out there that provide wonderful carbon storage and biodiversity benefits. They're also sexually mature, so they can provide seed, right? But they are also the size classes that EAB tends to prefer. We want some medium-sized trees. We want some smaller trees, out on the landscape, because we want to establish another generation of ash, because we want to sustain this species and that genetic material out on our landscape. Now, when we get through this first wave, and places like Michigan, Ohio are starting their second wave, it might be that the trees we start now in the second wave are the trees that EAB is feeding on in that second wave. However, we've at least kept ash out on the landscape, and we've maintained the genetic diversity, hopefully, and we've maintained options for the future while simultaneously things like science catch up, like species that can be introduced to control emerald ash borer. I would encourage you to not think that the game is over, that even after 15 years of infestation in Michigan and in Ohio, for example, not every tree has been killed. Now, they have coined this term lingering ash, meaning that it didn't necessarily survive it, but it survived it so far. It's sort of lingering. It's sort of hanging on. Whether it survives or not, we don't know. But it could be that, something like 2, 3, 4, 5% of ash, have shown themselves to be lingering. So we want to ensure that we have got a number of different seeds, different trees out in that landscape to perpetuate as much ash as we can. That means maintaining both male and females in the landscape. So we have seed source, so we have the ability to pollinate them. And that means that we need to have them in a close enough proximity that they can find each other, pollinate, and produce seed. This picture here is a picture of someone that's gone out. They've identified some females within their woodlot, within their property, and they're identifying them here with some paint. If you take a passive approach, and there are lots of people, or there's certainly a segment of people, they're very interested in taking a passive approach to their forest and its management. It is likely that without an active intervention, it's likely that most of the trees will succumb. It's not necessarily that all of the trees will succumb, but as I just said, there are lingering, we hope to continue to see lingering ash individuals within the population, but it's likely that most of the trees will die. So you have to sort of accept that. Now, there are some upsides to that in the short term, which is it increases the amount of dead wood. Dead wood is a component of our forest that is very much lacking from our forest, what the wood they would have historically been. So there is some dead wood that's created. The gap of the tree, the ash tree, that single gap, back to this shift from tolerant to intolerant, that gap of an ash tree that's created when a single ash tree dies is too small, typically, to regenerate ash. So there's just not enough sunlight if there are seedlings in there to bring that to fruition into the top of the canopy. The other thing that's important to point out is you can, depending on which way you want to take your forest management, you can take a passive approach, non-extractive forest management, but still provide an intervention, still go in and control invasive plants. So that would be something to consider. An important point that I didn't include in here that I should mention relative to bullet 3 is that we don't really see a lot of pure ash stands. It's pretty rare that most of our forests have an ash component of something like, 5 to maybe 20, no more than 30% of the trees of the basal area in ash. So we tend to see these little pockets of ash or individual ash trees spread out, which is why I mentioned that in bullet 3. One individual ash tree is typically not enough to create the sunlight necessary. So being able to identify these ash trees and these females is really important. So let's talk about some preservation strategies. So those are some things you can do in the upland. Here's some things you can do all across that resource gradient from wetland to upland. Lingering ash. There is a point in the wave of invasion where it's extremely important to know how fast it's moving and where it is. And we're still in some regions, this is still the place we're at. Is it here? Is it in our landscape? What should we be doing? At some point after the wave hits, it's probably more important to identify trees that haven't died. Like are we seeing some ash that are lingering? And that becomes a really important part of this preservation strategy. So being able to go out and identify them, that some trees that might have a genetic disposition or a mutation that are able to ward off emerald ash borer, being able to identify them, flag them, GPS them, and then collect seeds and encourage regeneration from these trees is a part of the long-term strategy. But we've got to keep ash on the landscape. That's the first key. But there's some really good genetic work going on, particularly in the Midwest, where they have been taking ash seeds and sort of testing them for the resistance and then propagating them. And that's going to take years, right? That could take decades to sort of get to scale. And in the meantime, I would suggest it's our job to keep the plate spinning. The other important thing you can do is create what we call preservation patches. So find groups of ash trees, like 10 to 15, 12 to 15 trees over a couple areas, a couple acres. Remember, we want these to be close enough that they can be wind dispersed in terms of their pollination, and they're close enough to fertilize each other. We want larger trees because those are the trees that are sexually mature. We would prefer to have these preservation patches on sites that are well adapted for ash. In other words, if an ash is growing on a dry site, it's sort of off site a little bit. It might be a little more stressed out. If it's a nice mesic site, that's a wonderful place to place or to site one of these preservation patches. We're looking for initially healthy trees, so dominant, co-dominant crown positions. We would like this to be heavy, these preservation patches, to be heavy to females. Females are the ones producing seeds. A few males can fertilize, a larger number of females. So we want that, dominated by females if possible. And if you're making decisions about time, energy, and resources, I would suggest that it's better to have fewer patches with more trees, because it'll be more concentrated and create a nice little patch, as opposed to more patches with fewer trees. So that's a preservation patch. And there are opportunities to actually treat these ash trees, and it's been highly effective. And at the start of EAB, foresters like myself said, oh, we don't do that. We don't treat individual trees. That's what they do in the built environment. You got to go talk to an arborist. And then at one point, we looked around and said, wait a minute, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. We know that, things like emamectin benzoate work. Why wouldn't we use that as a tool within the forest in these preservation patches? Because without some sort of treatment in these patches, it's very likely that they're going to succumb to EAB. So there are opportunities. Person needs to have obviously a valid pesticide applicators permit license. Doing this in the late spring or early summer, when things are moving around the tree, so the chemical is going to move around and spread. There are opportunities to stem inject these trees and sustain them, hopefully through this wave and future waves. One treatment lasts about 4 years, at least that's what people are finding, and it can be costly. I can share costs that have been shared with me if people are interested. But know that because of those costs, people have been not treating, they haven't been treating every tree within the preservation patch. And we are starting to see some adjacency effect, that even though not all the trees in the patch have been treated, those trees that have not been treated are showing some amount of resistance. So we don't know what that's about. It could be that EAB populations are low and woodpeckers are able to keep up with it. We're still not sure. And this is sort of the art of it. Like, we can't wait on the science. We've got to engage and work things out and share what worked and what didn't work. And this is one way to do that. I love this slide. I love this slide because it inspires me. And I'm partially in awe of Vermont. So any Vermonters out there, good for you. And I'm partially competitive and jealous of Vermont. Like, they're doing it. So this is a slide from the Vermont Land Trust. They are working on their fee properties and they're identifying preservation patches. They've done it on 10 properties so far. The Nature Conservancy has done it on 6. The Equinox Preservation Trust, which I've never heard of, I think is a small land trust, has done 1 patch on 1 preserve. You can read down the list all the way down to the Green Mountain National Forest. The idea is if we were able to do this across a landscape, we're sustaining this genetic material, we're sustaining this species across the landscape. And the more we concentrate it in a landscape, the more opportunities there are both for it to persevere into the future, cross-pollinate, but also when, I'm going to be optimistic, when we figure out EAB, then it's easy, we have this genetic material in a variety of locations and it can re-spread across the landscape. I would love to see this in Massachusetts. I love that it's multiple ownership types. I love that it's sort of at that landscape level, and I would encourage us to consider this. The other important role that land trust can play is you've got relationships with landowners who own their own land. You know, is there an opportunity to work with the budding landowners or to talk to them or to share if you decide to take on this strategy? Are there opportunities to communicate this to the landowners within your network and encourage them? The more people doing this across the landscape, the more likely, obviously, it is will sustain the species. Ash has a financial value. It's not as it doesn't bring as much money as red oak and black cherry, but it's it brings good value to it. But it could be, consider the fact that the highest value of ash isn't necessarily in its financial value, it's in its cultural value. And that may be of interest to you, but certainly it is of interest to our Indigenous partners. So are there opportunities to identify ash, particularly that black and brown ash, and to create Indigenous partnerships? This is a partnership that they've developed that's doing just great work up in Maine. I've put the website to the APCAW partnership. It's Abenaki, it's UMaine, it's TNC, and they're sort of working together on these strategies. Ash inventories, how do we know where it is? Where are the opportunities? Seed saving, as I mentioned, Les was really involved in that. And also from a land protection perspective, these cultural respect agreements. If you do have ash and we're sustaining it, what are the opportunities to allow Indigenous people to come on, to help cultivate, to help sustain the ash, but also potentially to use that for their cultural lifeways? I do want to be clear that because at least two of the species, green and black brown, grow in resource areas, that if you decide to pursue the preservation patch concept strategy with the injections, please know that there is a process through the Wetlands Protection Act. If you are in a different state, that may or may not be true. But I didn't want to be the person to be advocating for this and then have somebody get in trouble. So please know, and I've started scratching the surface of this. I had a conversation with someone at DEP that does this permitting, but just please recognize there's a process. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying just know that there's a process. The other thing I just wanted to bring up is what are the implications from a CR perspective, from a conservation easement perspective? Are there? We're facing a future where EAB is not going to be the last. ALB is not going to be the last. So in terms of drafting conservation easements, being aware of where these preservation strategies may be heading is, I think, an important consideration. Just a couple of resources. There are a couple of fellows out in Wisconsin that have a podcast called Silvacast. And so for those of you that are interested in podcasts, I think they do a very good job. It's a very casual conversation. Their most recent or their current podcast is on ash. And they have two women from the Forest Service, the Northern Research Station. One's an ecologist that has been really tracking ash and emerald ash borer in that Midwest area, which has been the longest time series. And they have a geneticist on there talking about lingering ash and the efforts to sustain that species. So if you're a podcast person, that might be something you want to check in on. They do a really nice job. It's a casual conversation. And the last resource I'll show is two papers that I did with my colleagues, and you can see their names there. I'll show them at the end of the slide as well. This is not, as I mentioned, this is not going to be our last time at the rodeo, unfortunately. And I think we need to, particularly from a natural resource management perspective, we need to incorporate into our thinking, our management, our land protection, species preservation, and not being okay with it, and being proactive about addressing these issues. And we're dealing with EAB. Other parts of the country are dealing with other invasive pests and things, and really doubling down on maintaining our diversity across our forest spectrum. So the first paper we did was just sort of a broad call for species preservation. And then that second paper is actually very specific to emerald ash borer and sustaining ash, and outlines several really neat, in Pennsylvania and Vermont and in Maine, really neat landscape scale partnerships between and among landowners and agencies and conservation organizations to do this kind of work. So I'll just close by thanking you for your time and thanking my partners here from Harvard Forest, from the tribe, from University of Maine, Nate Siegert at the Forest Service. We've been working, collaborating on those articles, and they were contributors to our publication here on the left that you can see. I've got hard copies of this. I would be happy to mail as many copies as you want for free. Just email me and we'll get that to you. And I want to acknowledge that we've got funding from the USDA to pursue this work and hopefully to inspire some preservation strategies in your landscape.
Paul, there's a number of questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to look at them yourself and try to respond to a few quickly.
Sure. Do you have one off the top?
Well, starting with a question of whether there's been any work getting dogs to identify emerald ash borer has been done with spotted
salamander. Yeah. No, I haven't. I mean, I've talked to people that have looked at turtles. I guess I talked to a person who had a dog trained for looking for endangered turtles. I have not heard of that from EAB, but that's a creative solution.
Also, you mentioned deer browse pressure. So, are there specific strategies to manage that?
You know, it's a hard challenge to wrap our minds around and our strategy around, because it's a moving target and we have such parcelized landscapes. There's no question that hunting is an effective tool. The problem is, how big of an area would you need to have a controlled hunt to really make a difference? So hunting, and of course we've seen less deer hunting pressure over time as fewer people hunt. We've seen more deer rise. There can be some challenges with that. Obviously, in terms of where people live and houses and parcel sizes. Some people, of course, don't like the ethical implications of that. So there are other strategies that one can use. One strategy that more people are adopting is called a slash wall. And essentially what that is within a timber harvest, the slash is that portion of the tree that is not merchantable. Like the tops of the trees, the branches, and so forth. So they will literally create a wall that is 10 feet at the base, 6 or 8 feet high around an area of the forest. And I've seen them up to, 10, 20, certainly acres, 30 acres. So they're creating essentially a wall to try to keep deer out at least for a first 5 or 10 years to get that flush of regeneration, to get the trees above the heights that deer will browse, and to try to ensure that it'll go forward. That is something that a lot of people are playing with. There is certainly deer fencing, but it can be expensive, and you've got to monitor that. There are tubes and things. So I guess we're still working on it, but those are some of the strategies people employ.
How about, is there work to develop or introduce predators to emerald ash borer, and corollary to that, work to develop resistant species beyond the chemical treatment?
Yeah, so yes on both counts. They are looking at introducing species native to Asia to help keep these populations in control. And the early indications is they have been effective. So that's good news. And I know there's always once it's done with that, then what does it eat? And so it's something we have to be very thoughtful about, because all things in our ecosystems are connected. But the good news is they do seem to be having some success with this introduction. This brings me to the point I made earlier. We've got to keep the plates spinning. I'm confident something will catch up, right? It'll take time. If that is effective, it'll take time for that to spread across the landscape. But we've got to, make sure there's ash out there to sustain it, to give us options in the future.
Paul, are there any resources to help forest owners figure out if they've got an infestation or what they've got,
Sure. So I think the obvious or the first, maybe the lowest level would be just take a walk yourself. It's wonderful to get to know your woods. It's wonderful to get to know some species within your forest. There is a deeper relationship with the forest that, when the species, when their characteristics, like human to human, the more you get to know somebody, sort of the more affinity you have for them. So I would encourage landowners to get to know, which is why I showed some slides on how to identify ash, get to know what ash looks like. Take a walk, take the opportunity to take the dog for a walk or walk with your partner and keep an eye on things. So that's number one. You can do that. And I would prioritize areas that are a little wet, just based on the site characteristics. You can also, I would encourage you to consider calling a forester and taking a walk. There's a service forestry program run by Mass DCR. You can go to masswoods.org, type in the town name, and up will pop the service forester that works in your region. They will do a free woods walk with you. He or she can come out and help you identify ash. You can also call a private forester. We have a whole cadre of private foresters that work across the state. Again, you can go to Mass Woods, find a professional, type in the town name, and up will pop a list of licensed foresters that work in your town.
I'm afraid we're at time, but there's still some great questions in the chat. I dare say I can promise that Paul can work on some responses and we'll try to get those out to folks. This was really a great presentation, Paul, and an awesome response. So thanks everybody for tuning in. And as Barbara noted, the presentation is posted on the conference portal.
Rob, can I say one thing? One last plea. We can't stand for this. We can't, not on our watch, right? We can't let ash go by on our watch. We all own a part of the forest. And so we each play a part, whether you're a land trust, you work for a municipality, you're a consulting forester, you're a landowner, we all play a part in this. And if we all do a little bit, it will add up across the landscape. So I please don't buy into the narrative that there's nothing we can do. And thank you for your time and listening.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thanks everybody. Take care.